All right, I think I'm live. For all of you out there, John is not here yet because he had to restart his computer. It was giving him trouble, so get the audio correct. I mean, it's one of these things that happens. It tends to happen just when you're about to go on the air. Is that you find out that where you were going to be giving your audio, where your microphone was going to come from, is not working properly. So we'll see if he can get his computer restarted, and hopefully everything will sound good on the other end. But meanwhile, I am here going to do a tap dance until he gets here. He should be here in a few minutes. I hope everyone's all right. If you, as you know, we do these things, live stream them every week, or at least when we're going to record. So if you have any questions or comments, you're always welcome to leave them down below, and we will try to get to them on our podcast, whenever that is, whenever we get it started. How am I doing? I'm doing fine. Yesterday, my wife has COVID, or had COVID. She just tested negative today. I tested positive yesterday, for everyone interested. So that's a fun thing. But I'm feeling fine, apart from not being able to sleep very well. It's one of these things where, having just this intermittent little cough is the most annoying thing when you're trying to sleep. Maybe some of you can relate. So sleeping has been a bit of an issue, but apart from that, I feel okay. I feel fine. A bit of a scratchy throat. That's about the only thing. I had a headache yesterday, but otherwise I'm feeling okay. So here we are. Hello. Oops, lost him. He's coming back. All right.
Unfortunately, it didn't change a thing. So
okay.
Our choice. We'll go with the bad, Mike.
All right.
Yes. How bad is it?
It's fine. It's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, it's fine. I was just telling our beautiful studio audience here that that I tested positive for COVID yesterday. Reme has COVID, and I have tested.
Oh, joy!
So yeah, but I'm feeling all right. So
yeah. Is it your first time?
Yeah.
It's your first COVID?
Yep.
Really? Wow.
Yep.
Wow. It's about time. Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, here we are.
All right. So, shall we get started?
Why don't we get started? Yeah.
Yes. All right.
You want to start, or should I start?
I will start.
Sounds good.
Okay. Greetings from Chicago, Doug. How are you?
I'm doing fine. As I mentioned to you just before we got started, I have tested positive for COVID right now. So I'm going to die with my boots on here. I'm out here podcasting with COVID, even though I feel fine, to be perfectly honest. So
podcasts took off during COVID,
That's right. That's right.
You can finally join the club.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm still waiting for movers. So hopefully by our podcast next week, I will have our good microphone and my Bose headsets, whatever we need. Anyway, so all will be well, and I'll have something to cook with. So.
Less important for the podcast, but more important for you personally.
Yeah. But I had a good week in Chicago. I went to the last Sunday. I went to the morning sesshin at the Ancient Dragon Zendo.
Oh, great!
Which is a fairly well-known Soto Zen sangha here in Chicago. And then Wednesday night, I went to a Zen meditation at the university that is one of the many meditation organizations on campus. But I was particularly interested in this one because I knew somebody that was involved, and then ended up having dinner with a bunch of PhDs and a couple of young students, and it was really fun, actually.
That's cool.
Yeah. me with my lowly bachelor's, know.
But you have the
Anyway,
practice.
that's true. I do, and yeah, it was great. I mean, the thing was, one was a PhD in physics, another was a PhD in comparative lit, another was
Oh, cool.
PhD in physics as well, and Masters of Divinity, and then a student who was a PhD in music theory. So it was like,
Wow.
it
Wow.
wasn't, but we didn't get on any of those topics. It was all about meditation and
Sure.
the difference between various traditions. Yeah, so it's been good. And of course, watching the debate on Tuesday night, and
Yeah.
which
I can't
was,
watch those, but yeah.
well, it was interesting, and well, it wasn't interesting. It was entertaining, I should say, um, and kind of, I guess, leads us into the topic for today,
Yep.
um,
Sort of a
which I
bi-yearly
suppose,
topic, right? I mean, every 2
yeah,
years, every
right.
4 years,
Right.
something like that.
What would the Buddha do in a voting booth, or however you
Yeah.
want to, which, yeah, I think more to the point is how was the Buddhist, how was the Buddha political, but also as uh, practicing Buddhists or people who subscribe to Buddhist practice. When is politics appropriate and when
Mm.
is it not?
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so it's an interesting topic. I know you've done some podcasts on it, or some
Or videos, yeah.
YouTube videos.
Yeah, and those are
Um,
2 very different questions.
mhm.
I mean, I think you really have to separate them. One being the question about if we might say, the historical Buddha, or the evidence we have from early Buddhism about politics and the Buddha's kind of involvement or lack thereof in politics. And another really is how we as contemporary practitioners should confront political issues and social issues ourselves.
Yeah, of
I
course.
mean, they're very complex, but they're and I think we have to be careful not to assume that they're the same thing, because I mean, the Buddha himself, I think pretty clearly, and this is something that a number of scholars have talked about, was less than sanguine about entering into political discussions. I mean, he did. I mean, we're not saying he never did, but for the Buddha, I mean, I think the big thing we have to keep in mind is that the story is that the Buddha, when he began, could have become a wheel turning monarch, or he could have become a Buddha, and his decision was to become a Buddha. That is to say, he could have gotten involved in political things, or he could have gotten involved in the Dharma, and he decided to get involved in the Dharma instead. And ever since then, at least within the early tradition, there's this kind of, I think, very definite hierarchy that dharmic practice, attainment of enlightenment, is superior to any other goal. And so, to that extent, while politics may have a role to play, in sort of worldly, I mean, as a central place to play in worldly things, it's not the sort of supramundane aim that the Buddha was
Right,
really after. And
right.
so, to that extent, I think the Buddha was sort of less than, I mean, it's not that this is unimportant to the Buddha, but it was very much of secondary importance. Now, how we make of that today is, I think, a separate issue, because
Right.
our political landscape now is completely different from that of 5th century BCE India. I mean, it's
Well,
just really very,
yeah,
very different.
and it's not that he was apolitical. I would say, at least before he was the Buddha.
Yeah.
In fact, I mean, I think what's really interesting, and I was reminded of this by my beloved partner, um, in a talk that I heard her give earlier this week. So, and I think I brought this in once before, but we have this uh, the traditional story of the four sights, and what sort of led the Buddha to leaving his wife and kid, and moving into the world of wandering ascetics. Um, that's a traditional story, which in many ways makes no sense at all.
Yeah,
That
and
he
it's
would have
not
that he would have
original either.
no.
So,
And but another version of why he left is actually much more logical. which is that there was this, and this dispute is in the suttas, but it's considered to be later after he had become the Buddha, which was the dispute that the Sakyans, his family clan, and were over water rights with uh, the Kolyas. Kolyas, I think it's,
Kolias, I think, yeah.
and they were all ready to go to war
Do you know where
over
this comes
this.
from? Because I think you've
Yeah.
mentioned this, and I
So,
don't
well, I
know.
mean, it was sort of published. Ambedkar is the first person that brought it forward in his versions of the Dharma, but it actually has started to be more researched. She said it came from this. The person who's doing the most research has done the most research so far is DDR Kosabi. Kosabi.
I don't know. I'd have to see the paper.
But
Yeah, it would be
but
great
she
if you could
also
find
said
it.
that Amalio is actually doing some work on it as well, just
Mm,
in terms of dissecting these early, where did these early stories come from?
mm,
Anyway, the Buddha basically became a conscientious objector because it was the only way to save his family.
mhm,
In other words, if he had simply said, "I'm not going to go to war. I disagree with you. I'm not going to vote for this," because he was part of the council, they would have thrown him out and taken, and his family would have been ostracized. But back then, it was actually okay if you just disagreed and if you said, "Well, no, I'm actually going to I'm going to put myself in exile as a wandering ascetic."
mm.
Therefore, his family was saved because that wasn't considered a disgrace to the family or the community.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
I mean, it's just a story I've literally never heard, and I
mhm.
mean, from looking at the stuff from the Pali Canon, I just don't recall it ever having come up. So, I just don't
Right,
know where that story originates. Now, it's quite possible that there's some story that I just haven't run across yet because I'm certainly not, I have certainly haven't read every last word. So, it's just I haven't
right.
recalled people talking about it either. So,
I know it's fascinating though.
um,
It's also but I mean the story of the war over the water is in the sutras at some point. Just, and so it's like, oh, okay. In any event, the point is, it puts a different spin on his attitude toward issues.
mhm,
And of course, right then he was still in the sort of he was in his bodhisattva stage of he was still not fully awakened, but he had cultivated a sense of non-harm and non-violence. So we could consider him the first conscientious objector. But and then of course, when it came to caste and things like that, he
yeah,
and even women, he became quite uh, he spoke to it and he acted accordingly. Um, but of course, yeah, politics was a little different back then, and he was a consult to kings and things like that. Um, and now the question is, and of course, when we uh, think of our involvement in the world as practicing, uh, as when we take on the precepts, when we take on um, right speech, um, how do we see ourselves as political beings, and how do we act on that? Um, and we're not taking a political stance one way or the other right now. We easily could, but we also make assumptions about others who practice. That we assume they are more progressively leaning, which may not always be the case. And I've gotten into trouble making those assumptions. Um, and so, but if we actually, brought a Buddhist worldview into the ballot box, how would we uh, make a decision? You know,
yeah. Well, and
and that's where
one,
it gets interesting.
yeah, no, absolutely. And one, I did a video on this quite a while ago. There's one, and I'm not going to remember exactly because it was again a while ago that I did this research. But there's one sutta where the Buddha is basically um, considering the problem about becoming a ruler, a monarch of some kind, and and the downsides, and the fact that, in order to be an effective ruler, you're essentially required to do some things sometimes that are less than savory. I mean, there's just sort of no way out of it. To be a policeman, you've got to throw people in jail.
Right.
And and to that extent, I think he as a result, I think that's one of the reasons why the Buddha was very skeptical about politics. Was his feeling, I think, that while politics was we might say politics is a necessary evil for the Buddha. It requires you to get involved in things that are going to cause negative karma, but on the other hand, there's sort of no way out of it. And so, I think the Buddha's feeling was, leave that to somebody else. That's not, that's not something that interested him. And so when we think about being in the voting booth, we're always going to be faced with two options, neither of whom is perfect. And to the extent that we think one of them is perfect, we're deluding ourselves, for
Right.
sure.
Right.
Because politics to me is a place where the idea of not letting the perfect become the enemy of the good is sort of it's where it is. I mean, it's sort of like nothing is ever perfect, and so what you're trying to do is find the better of two not perfect alternatives. Now, I mean, in my opinion, this particular political season involves one of the clearest comparisons between two options that we have had. Well, I mean, we've had the same comparison recently, but I mean, two of the clearest, that we've had in the history of the country. But nevertheless, that doesn't mean that either of them is perfect. And I think if we're looking for that, we're gonna have a hard time pulling a lever for either
For sure.
one.
Yes. Yeah. By the way, the name was, I had it wrong. It's Damodar Kasambi, who was
Okay.
an Indian scholar, and he died in the late 40s. And so his work is now being, he's a Pali language expert, and some of this appears in his work, which would have makes sense then that would have influenced Ambedkar, because they were not exactly contemporaries, but they would have crossed over, and Ambedkar, created his own version of the Dharma, and it's a whole other thing which we can have Upadi on to talk about, but. And it's quite fascinating that he didn't rewrite the Dharma, but he wrote it in a way that would make more would reflect more the life of the Dalit world that he grew up in.
Yeah, I mean, he also in his sort of magnum opus, or one of his magnum opus, whatever you want to say, his Buddha and his Dharma. He has a lengthy section about the Buddha's life, which includes a lot of information. A lot. I mean, probably most of the information is non-historical. I mean, does not come from any history that I'm familiar with. It's stuff that, at least according to the editors of the volume I have, which is from Oxford, a lot of it came from a relatively recent play, I think, about the Buddha, where the playwright, I think, constructed a lot of narrative about the Buddha's lifetime, filling in stuff that we don't know, which is normal to do. And
it's great.
It's been done.
You have that freedom.
Yeah, it's been done so many times over the history of the world. But I mean, again, there's a distinction between the stories that we write in order to capture what we want to about somebody in modern terms, and the history, what we could at least theoretically, with the few little strands we have, say might be historical. And that's something that interests me, that distinction, but not obviously
absolutely
everybody.
Yeah. Anyway, that's a whole other podcast, right? For which I should only be an auditor. But I think the other place where we can get stuck around politics is holding to a fixed view,
Yeah.
of course, and uh, we see that in our politicians all the time, and we certainly see it within voters,
Hmm.
and the voting public and ourselves as voters. And I realize that to some degree we have listeners all over the world, and not every place where you're listening may be part of a democracy. Some of it, or it may be in a much more functional democracy, perhaps, than even we have.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure we have a functional democracy per se, the way our
Oligarchy more
system is
like,
set
but
up.
yeah.
Well, I mean, just we have this crazy electoral college system, which
Yeah.
nobody outside of the U.S. understands, and most people in the U.S. don't understand it. But John Stewart the other day had a beautiful redrawing of the map of the country where the seven states that matter were they created he sort of made up a name for that, made up of all their short initials, and the rest of the country was who gives a shit out, who gives
Yeah.
a shit,
Yeah.
yeah, or something like that. It was like, yeah, we don't count.
Yeah.
Um, but but then there's the whole famous line from many years ago from Tip O'Neill, who said all politics is local. And when we put that in a kind of context of, say, a sangha, which is about as local as we can get uh, in a Buddhist framework, a community of practitioners, you know, uh, depending on the nature of the sangha, stuff comes up all the time, and in the monastic world, it certainly comes up when they have meetings and discuss differences and how they kind of work with that. Um, and I don't know if monks vote. I can't imagine that somebody like Bhikkhu Bodhi wouldn't be voting.
Well, I'm sure they
Um,
do. I'm sure they vote. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's certainly not. It's nowhere in the Vinaya, but then why it wouldn't have found a way in the Vinaya, because I don't think voting was something that
Right.
happened, except making sangha decisions. Um, and engaged Buddhists are engaged Buddhists, and our engagement in this country is one of political action.
Hmm.
Uh, and so, but that question of how we make a decision and how our views are created,
Hmm.
I think is a really interesting one. And if we put it in the context of the precepts, if we put it in the context of the paramis, perfections of the heart, you know, what moves us to vote for one person or another is perhaps, um, is this person honest? Is this person truthful? Does this person harm others consciously or unconsciously? I mean, as a president, you end up, when it comes to presidential politics, right? You harm others unconsciously. You know that you're going to harm people one way or the other, um, at least in terms of working, because the military is under your command, so you can't not harm. Um, I mean, assuming there's a conflict that requires the military, which these days is inevitable. So, then it's a question of, well, then uh, uh, what level of humility and uh, truthfulness is somebody going to bring into those actions, which then may require harming others? So,
Yeah.
in a way, it's like doing the least harm possible.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and I
yeah,
mean, you were mentioning about not clinging to fixed views, and I think that the other side of that coin is not losing sight of you know hiri no tapa, these kind of
right,
ideas of
right,
your own sense of conscience and prudence, these sort of essential human characteristics, that we have a conscience, that we see things are right and wrong, that we avoid the things that we feel are wrong. So it's, it's kind of this is one of the we want to say paradoxes of the Buddha's own approach, which I think is so delightful. I mean, it's a delightful paradox. Is this idea that on the one hand, the Buddha was very much, I would say, an ethical realist. I mean, that there really were, things that were right and things that were wrong. It wasn't simply that, somebody's decision made it right and wrong. No. There are real things you should do and shouldn't do, but at the same time, you shouldn't cling to views. So how do
Right.
you hold those two at the same time? How do you not lose sight of your own ethical compass, which I think is so important not to lose sight of, at the same time that you're not becoming too rigid, and part of that lack of rigidity is itself part of the ethical compass, is to realize that being too rigid itself is not a good thing, is not healthy, that
Yeah.
some situations require more finesse just because of how they are. So,
Well,
I mean, go ahead. Yeah.
they require wisdom.
Yeah, absolutely require wisdom.
And it's like, and wisdom means, seeing through what you're holding on to, and among other things, right? Uh, and taking the time to actually look more closely,
Yeah.
to really, and this is the challenge. And we can think of so many moments in, fairly recent history where that never happens.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
where where leaders are working on the basis of reactivity and not appropriate response.
Yeah. Fixed views.
And
Yeah.
so, when weighing a decision about someone, it's like, oh, okay, so is this person more likely to at least take a few beats before making a big decision? It's really going to look and sort of look at all the conditions that are causing it and the conditions that will result from it. Um, and there's this came up in a talk I was listening to earlier this week. This difference, the importance of looking not only at your own intention but at the impact of that intention. And so, how many leaders really look at the impact of an intention, which seems the intention itself may be rooted in logic or maybe rooted in some level of political understanding of a treaty or of a whatever, um, but then the impact of the decision that intention is leading you to, the decision that is the impact of the decision going to really fulfill that intention, or is
Hmm.
it something else going to be created? um, and we see that all the time.
Yeah. I mean, is the person willing and able to do the kind of investigation? I mean, one of the
Right.
great parts of Buddhist practice is this investigation. And I think, to my mind, one of the things you're looking for in a potential leader is somebody who's curious and willing to look at and research and investigate before acting.
Yeah.
Um, and of course, you know that the world being the way it is, you have to make decisions with imperfect information. There's just no other way to do it. You don't have
For
the
sure.
luxury of spending 10 years researching a problem that's going to, precipitate in a month. So,
Yeah.
understanding all of that, you still want somebody who's willing to put in the work and has the curiosity and intelligence and wisdom.
Yeah.
So that would be, I mean, I think, and I don't see anything certainly in the Buddha's own views that would go against that view. I mean, I think that would be the kind of thing he would expected and looked for in a leader. And certainly he
Yeah.
did see that certain leaders were to be more lauded than others. Those who kept, kept up the poor and did not were not greedy and distributed wealth, and all the rest of those are the kinds of leaders that he looked up to. Again, not feeling that any of them were perfect, but nevertheless feeling that there was a hierarchy and a sense of certain leaders who were wiser and should be looked up to, and others who were not.
And he certainly, I mean, just going back to the story I was telling before, which whenever it happened, it did happen. I mean, there is some record of this water dispute happening, and he would have been the first one to say, no, we have to talk. Let's talk. There's enough to go around here. Let's talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
Let's figure this out instead of let's fighting about it. So, and so, yeah. In any event, I think that as we're coming toward the end of this particular discussion, the point is get out and vote.
Yeah, absolutely.
Vote wisely.
Mm-hmm. Register if you're not registered.
Bring whatever wisdom you have into the voting booth.
Mm-hmm.
But it is important to be, and for those of you that aren't U.S. citizens or don't live in the U.S., we have another month and a half before the election, so this may come up again or things may happen. But you can enjoy the show from afar.
Well, and get involved in your own way wherever you can, in ways that you feel are most wise and skillful. And of course, if you don't feel that you can, that you're in the right place for that, then that's fine. But if you feel that you can, it's a good way to, to spend the time.
Yeah. Well, whatever I was going to say just left. So,
well, I would say another good way to spend the time is by having a cup of coffee, which, I forgot to get my cup of coffee yesterday afternoon, and I was regretting it yesterday, but yeah, you have yours with you. I had mine earlier.
Always. I actually was reminded the other day of this young woman who was giving a little talk at this sitting I went to. It was talking about a retreat she went on recently at a monastery Mahayana monastery outside of Spokane, and the head monastic, who was a nun, she refused to have coffee on the site. And so this woman had to practice not having coffee, before she went on retreat. I don't know. Plenty of monastics I know are really into coffee.
Yeah, I think this woman's missing out. But hey, to each their own. Yeah. And you can always get decaf. You can always have decaf if that's what you really want. So.
Well, I don't know what it was, but maybe she had her own attachment to get over. So yeah. Yes. Okay, friends. Well, I hope this has been elucidating in some way, and yeah. So don't. I guess the theme here is being a practicing Buddhist or taking on Buddhist practices is not a reason not to vote. In fact, it's a reason to vote. So get out there and register. Next Saturday, I'm going to go up to Wisconsin and do some polling. So yeah.
Good. And we'll leave a link to leave a link down in the notes or in the notes to registering to vote in case you haven't registered and you're a U.S. in the United States. So U.S. citizen. Yeah.
Okay. Until then, keep digging the Dharma.
Indeed.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Be well.